in the mid to late 50s was higher in terms of GDP per capita than a number of European countries, and we know where they are because of some of the choices that they have made over the last decade or so. Just quickly recapping some of the specific forecasts. So as I mentioned, developing Asia and Africa are going to grow the fastest from our perspective. I know it's a busy chart, but basically it shows Central and Eastern Europe, obviously the ex-Soviet states, CIS, Latin America, Middle East, developing Asia, and then Africa. As you see, both, Africa, we believe, has gone beyond the inflection point because of obviously the commodity price increases, as well as a significantly improved governance in a number of countries where governments are making the right choices and really creating a political environment to sustain long-term growth. And so we see significant growth in all of these markets. On the right side, we show the growth projected for some of the advanced economies, and as you can see, the trajectory is not that great. We're going to touch on that for a couple of minutes in terms of obviously the massive debt problems that some of these countries exhibit today. And then even on the real GDP per capita growth, you see at the bottom of the page, the biggest percentage increases being in developing Asia and Africa. So what that is going to result in from our perspective, today if you look at the composition of world GDP in 2010, the US or North America and Western Europe account for 41% of the total world GDP, and developing Asia only accounts for 27%. Based on our projections over the next 30 to 40 years, by the year 2050, developing Asia will be almost 50% of the GDP of the globe, with North America and Western Europe declining to 18%. So fairly tectonic shifts, especially when you look at it in the context of the overall growth in the global GDP itself. Just going a little deeper on Asia in terms of, and I'm again, in the interest of time, I'm going to focus on the key slides. The first, one of the biggest drivers of what's going on in Asia is the whole investment base. And we have obviously talked about that in the context of Indonesia and the need for infrastructure growth. But obviously countries like China have spent a massive amount of money in developing their economies. Other countries have still a lot to go, as we've talked about India. I mean, we have been talking about infrastructure development in India for the last 25 years. And while we have been talking about it, China has just totally turned the whole place upside down. So clearly there's a lot more to go and increasing focus on making more investments. But clearly there is a lot of catch-up which we expect to happen over the next couple or 3 decades. Similarly, in terms of emerging markets and trade, we have talked about the role of China today in terms of how much money they make on the products that they sell. But clearly, if you look at China-US trade, but beyond that, China emerging markets trade or China developed markets trade, a huge amount of exports from China are going all over the world, and a huge amount of exports from the West are coming into this part of the world as well. So the tying in of the economies has become massive. And even within Asia, if you look at the right side of the page, whether it's Indonesia, whether it's India, whether it's Philippines or Taiwan, an increasing amount of obviously the trade is happening within this corridor. We have talked a lot about the consumer, the Asian consumer, and how the Asian economies are going to be able to transition, especially the large economies, from an export-oriented base to a domestic consumption base. Obviously, Indonesia already is ahead of that curve, and that's been driving a huge part of the growth. But again, if you look at these pages and you look at where the domestic consumption in countries like China and India are, there is a tremendous upside. On the right side, we show that the number of households in India and China that have an average income of more than $10,000 is almost 100 million today. And if you look at the chart of what's the dotted line on the right side, the pace of that growth is significant. At the same time, and we won't have enough time to talk about this today, the growth of asset aggregation in pension funds and sovereign wealth funds and central banks in Asia has never been seen before. And both the Chinese economy, the Korean economies, the Malaysian economies, the Japanese economy, all of them are focusing on increasing the social safety net.